Good evening. I'm Richard Sommer, the Dean of the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design, and it's my pleasure to welcome you this evening to What Shapes the City, the third event in the Daniels Faculty's 2016-17 series. Now, some of you would be familiar in previous years with our Fora series. The format tonight is similar to this, but I should probably introduce, actually this year, because of our big transition to the One Spadina Crescent, although we're not in there yet, we decided to do fewer events this year, but have each event have some of the character of the Fora from the past, which is all of the events feature dialogues and interaction between people from our own fields in architecture, art, landscape, and design with people from other fields around issues of import to the city and to our work. So, and tonight will be no exception to that. Now, before introducing tonight's speakers, I'd like to take a moment to thank our friends at Herman Miller for once again providing the furniture on stage for tonight's discussion. Tonight's a very white and beige theme.
We have black.
We appreciate the, in many
black.
more ways than one. We appreciate the opportunity to showcase Herman Miller's award-winning design and continue to be thankful for its partnership with us on this. So on to our featured speakers. Now, Richard Florida should really need very little introduction here, but I'm going to do it anyway. For those of you who may be young or, coming from a different place. Richard is the director of cities of the Martin Prosperity Institute and a professor here at University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management. He is also the global research professor at New York University. He's a senior editor for The Atlantic, where he co-founded and serves as editor-at-large for CityLab, an online media site devoted to cities and urban affairs. Richard is also the founder of the Creative Class Group, a global advisory services firm that grew out of his highly influential book, The Rise of the Creative Class. His forthcoming book, The New Urban Crisis, his forthcoming book is The New Urban Crisis: How Our Cities Are Increasing Inequality, Deepening Segregation, and Failing the Middle Class, and What We Can Do About It. We'll explore some of the most vexing challenges facing cities and argues that we need to generate a new model of urbanism to address them, and I hope we get into some of those issues tonight. Adam Greenfield is a London-based urbanist and writer, the founder and managing director of Urban Scale, and an advocate for the human-centered design of technological systems. His most recent best-selling book, Against the Smart City, is a critique of the idea of network cities and the much ballyhooed goal of smart cities to harness the power of technology and to achieve greater levels of efficiency, sustainability, and security.
That's the stuff I don't believe in, just to be clear.
That's what he's critical of, the much ballyhooed argument of smart cities. His next book, which should come out this spring, is entitled Radical Technologies, the Design of Everyday Life, and is dedicated to exploring the technologies that are transforming our lives, questioning values they reproduce, the kinds of choices they present us with, and how we might still be able to shape their impact on our shared future. Adam has actually an incredibly diverse, and actually, I would say actually cool background. He has been a rock critic for Spin Magazine, a San Francisco bike messenger, a medic at the Berkeley Free Clinic, and between 1995 and 2000, a psychological operations specialist, and later a sergeant, at the 7 Psych Ops unit of the United States Army Special Operations Command. So don't fool around. Between 2006 and 2010, he was Nokia's head of design for design direction for service and user interface. Earlier in that decade, he worked as a lead information architect for the Tokyo office of the internet consultancy Razorfish. Greenfield teaches at both NYU and the Bartlett School of Architecture in London. Now, the question we have posed for tonight, what shapes the city, requires a little bit of explanation. We're interested in asking which disciplines and forms of expertise can today claim to have the ideas, the techniques, and the political agency to help shape the city. We know that those of us who come from the social sciences, economists, sociologists, ethnographers, political scientists, business, commerce, and governance experts, and policy-based planners, and I would actually include lawyers in this group, have their take on the city and their particular forms of agency. Those of us in the harder science side, engineers and scientists with the materials, environmental, and computation-based approach, have another take and another form of agency around making the city. Those of us, and there's probably more of us in this room, from the more creative imagination-based fields such as architecture, art, design, and landscape and the planning arts, we stake our own claim. Yet the sheer scale and pace of urbanization in recent history and the politics and technologies at play in the making and remaking of the city render any one of these disciplinary clusters insufficient to the challenge of accounting for what the city is today, let alone being able to shape the future, any future of the city. So we have on the one hand, a liberalization of urban real estate development processes, wherein private capital often operates on a global scale in ways that reshape the physical and social geography of cities, and we're seeing that today in parts of Toronto, maybe all over Toronto. And on the other hand, a slow but steady growth, at least in some places, in the rights individuals, groups, and communities have to be represented in the processes of planning and imagining their own spaces. So we must address two overlapping realities. One, that the social, political, and environmental problems faced by our cities today are too complex for any one social science, engineering, or design discipline, or any expertise to contend with alone. And two, that even if any so-called expert had some solution, no field or expertise has enough of a platform or agency under the scenarios that I've just described, where extra-governmental power the extra governmental power of capital markets shapes cities, and where perhaps the only resistance or bulwark against these forces is represented by participatory modes of planning and design that themselves often have little patience for experts. So many of us got cut out in my view, in that equation. So even what was once understood to be bottom-up planning is more and more overtaken by the emerging rhetorics and discourses around smart cities, data-driven planning, and crowdsourced design. So, and many of us in these various fields will work on one side of that equation, either through the real estate industries or for the kind of planning processes. So this is actually what we were supposed to talk about tonight. And we have two people who have devoted themselves to these questions and whose work consciously transcends, I think, the disciplines that they come out of. Richard is trained as an economist, but his work has been most influential at the intersection between political theory, development economics, and urban planning. Greenfield comes out of cultural theory and has, broadly speaking, been dedicated to surfacing and challenging the oppressive and coercive undercurrents of the digital revolution. Adam is advocating, for example, for the emancipatory potential of technology, because what we call technology is really a much larger set of phenomena and is really, you might say, the big disruptor in the urban equation today. So I will serve as the moderator tonight, and I guess I'm here as a recovering architect and urban designer. Mm-hmm. So I should say that our conversation tonight is, after I've described what we're supposed to be talking about, it's likely to take a bit of a swerve from what we had originally intended, given the election results in the United States a few weeks ago, and the way that this turn of events has put a spotlight on the place of cities in the physical and social geography of the United States, but not only the United States, but on similar dynamics elsewhere. Finally, I want to say, in posing the question, what shapes the city, my colleagues and I do not mean to imply that actually the three American-born guys on the stage tonight in any way represent the diversity of thinking or the people who might actually shape the city, here or elsewhere. We actually don't shape the city. When we ask what shapes the city, we certainly don't always mean us. This is in some ways a discussion about the relationship between ideas and urban disciplines and the urban disciplines that advance them, and how they might empower or if we are not careful, contribute to disempowering the people who might actually shape the city. So with that, I'm going to turn over the stage well, not the stage, we're going to sit down, and Richard gets to go first.
Good. Well, thank you, Richard. Thanks to the Daniel School of Architecture and I look forward to this conversation with you and Adam, whose work I have long admired, and who is a very perceptive interpreter of urban life and technology and a very important critic of prevailing theories. Who shapes the city? If we had this conversation 2 weeks ago, I would have had a very different take on that. I think for the first time in my life, and I'm 58, about to turn 59, it's not necessarily the people in the city. The forces of reaction in this world have reasserted themselves in a way that not just no one else could have anticipated, and they are going to shape the city in ways that are difficult at best and devastating at worst. I have long said for the past decade and a half that we are living through the greatest economic and social transformation in human history, that heretofore, across all of human civilization, up to very recently, the past several decades, we used our backs and our muscle and our legs and our strength to transform nature in agrarian societies and industrial societies. And I mentioned the fact that even during the Industrial Revolution, a transformation that I think was very disruptive, but not as disruptive as now, we fought 2 world wars, had several massive depressions, saw the rise of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, fascism, communism of the Stalinist sort. And I said, this transformation is bigger because for the first time we no longer use our backs and our brawn. The mind itself, our human intellect, creative power, has become the means of production. If I look past the past decade, we've had some traumatic events. We had the dot-com crash of the year 2000, 9/11 in 2001. We had the Gulf War, the election of George W. Bush. I then moved to Canada. That's neither here nor there. I didn't know how...
Always a trendsetter.
I didn't know how bright of a decision that was until 2 weeks ago. We then saw climate-oriented events like Katrina and Sandy. And in rapid succession, 3 things that I never would have imagined. I never would have imagined that Rob Ford, the dysfunctional and most anti-urban mayor in world history, would have been elected mayor of this city. I would have never imagined that our friends on the other side of the Atlantic would have voted for Brexit. And in fact, I told everyone that having seen the lunacy of that decision, no one in their right mind would the United States elect Donald Trump. But here we are. 2 days away or 3 days away from American Thanksgiving. Boy, that's going to be a joyous event. The New Urban Crisis. Well, I spent the past week rewriting that book from top to bottom in electronic galleys. The very forces of clustering and density and knowledge creation that have given rise to the greatest time of innovation and economic progress in human history are the same forces that divide us. That is the contradiction that sits at the heart of the New Urban Crisis. That is the contradiction of our time. The very thing that motivates, the reason cities grow, for one fundamental fact that Jane Jacobs identified 50 years ago in her most important work, second most important work. We'll come in a minute to her most important and prescient work, The Economy of Cities. She identified, I asked Jane, what did you think was your most fundamental contribution? She said, Richard, I think I figured out something that all other economists overlooked, including you, is that what really drives economic growth isn't the accumulation of research and development or technology or economies of scale by corporations. It's the clustering of talented, diverse groups of people and firms and startups and cities. Well, I was, maybe not all of us. And I talk in the book about the urban optimist, of which I included myself until very recently. The urban optimist who believed this clustering force was a force for good, that it was a force for innovation, that its benefits would be widely shared. How naive was that? That this clustering force has divided, and my wake-up call was not Donald Trump, it was Rob Ford. I read with great interest the work of our great colleague here, David Holchansky, on his work on the three cities of Toronto. There was a middle-class city where boats were rising, where people participated in industry, where many, maybe not everybody, but many people's fortunes were rising. We had stable middle-class neighborhoods. And sometime in the past couple of years, couple of decades, with the rise of the knowledge economy, the urbanized, I correct myself, it is not a knowledge economy. It is an urbanized knowledge economy, where the key motor force isn't knowledge, it's the packing of knowledge, the clustering of knowledge in dense, spiky urban centers. And what David said was, yes, that old Toronto had been eviscerated and had been replaced by a new Toronto. A Toronto of small areas of concentrated advantage in and around the urban core, around transit spikes. I can add my own in the United States, around research institutions, knowledge institutions, areas of coastlines and amenity, hillsides. And everyone else was being pushed outside of that. They were infilling the disadvantaged areas of the city that remained. They were being pushed out to the peripheral areas of the suburb. Our cities were being transformed into areas, small areas of concentrated affluence and larger areas of disconnected, concentrated disadvantage. That produced the backlash, which gave us Rob Ford. That produced the backlash, which gave us Brexit. That produced the backlash which gave us Donald Trump. I've been writing all about this in City Lab. I had two pieces last week. I will have one tomorrow on the metropolitan scale. If you look at Mrs. Clinton's vote, remember she won she's going to have a majority of 1.7 million voters.
2 million.
1.7 million voters or more. But because the US has a system called the Electoral College, which is geographically determined, she lost the election because the blue people occupy those centers of creativity, urbanity, density, knowledge. The fault lines of our new society are the fault lines of class and geography, knowledge and density. We've run the analysis. We've actually built the maps which show the blue votes concentrated in about a dozen places throughout the United States amidst a sea of red. No one could have seen how unbelievable this backlash would be. And I just want to mention Jane Jacobs' most important work, which she wrote about the time we met, and we had a chance to interact on a stage like this. Do you remember the title of it?
Yeah.
Dark Age Ahead. Written a decade before these events. And what did Jane say so presciently? There were several forces that would foretell this: the decline of the family, the decline of schooling, the post-fact, post-evidence-based, post-scientific, the fact that the professions would no longer, like I'll call them the Republican Party, would no longer police themselves, and the dumbing down of taxes, so that we would create a culture in where the very investments we need to grow and prosper and to build knowledge-based societies would be seen as the things that hold us back. I've spent nearly 6 decades as an American. I know US history pretty well. Even with the Civil War, there was not a time in US history where the geographic and political sources of reaction have now imposed themselves on the city. This election, if Trump really does succeed in curtailing not just trade, it's not the flow of goods, it's the flow of people. If he can really curtail the flow of people, if he really clamps down on immigration, if he begins to cut off aid to so-called sanctuary cities, if he invests in roads and bridges and not in transit, if he curtails investment in affordable housing, all of these things which look very plausible, for the first time, the very centers of progress, urban, dense cities, will live in an environment in which the political reality curtails and cuts off that source of innovation. One last note, which is the only note I'm optimistic. I have spent a lot of time rereading by Jane Jacobs. A lot of time, and I'm going to be writing on this. I come to the conclusion that Jane was a really, really substantial pessimist. Born in the mining town of Scranton, watching the mining town of Scranton collapse, moving to New York City in 1934 at the height of the Great Depression, watching the advent of fascism, Stalinism, authoritarianism, watching her field of urbanism, which she loved, be turned into top-down city planning. But I think Jane found a source of optimism that I think we all can draw on, that what she saw was the only glimmer of hope left in civilization was our cities. The one last bastion where human beings could congregate in their full diversity, in their full flourishing, in a democratic and a difficult democratic environment. So I would say the thing that gives me really hope in the long run is that although the backlash has come, our cities still remain the font of economic progress. In my own life, I have lived through several cycles of urban growth and decline. I was born in Newark, New Jersey, when it was a thriving, bustling city. I saw that city and the plant my dad worked in collapse. I watched urban areas like Pittsburgh begin to renew themselves. I watched the renewal get so far that it created a new urban crisis of success and housing unaffordability. These cycles come and go, but I think the one thing we can be sure of is that the path out of these dark days lies with our people in neighborhoods and communities and cities. Thank you, guys. No need.
Yeah, I'm going to come at things from a slightly different perspective. And I'm particularly not going to concentrate on things which have to do with modes of knowledge production in particular, because I think if there's anything that the recent experience of the US election and Brexit before it taught us, it's that our modes of knowledge production are broken in that they don't really tell us that much that's useful about the world. Our modes of institutional discovery, our modes of exploring the world and representing that world back to us as data appear to have something fundamentally wrong with them. So I'm going to talk instead about affect and feeling. And in answer to the question, what shapes the city, let me do this. Let me ask you, albeit from across the border, I'm going to ask each of you, what was your response to the US election results? Just shout out some words that occur to you. I heard one person say the thing I was looking for.
Which was?
Fear.
Yeah, me too.
We're living in fear right now. And I think fear is actually a larger shaper of the reality of the city than is ordinarily understood or discussed. And I'm particularly interested in the kind of fear that is experienced by people who are already quite powerful and quite privileged, and how they enact that fear and the consequences of that fear. So that's what I'd like to discuss for a little bit. I have a slightly different take than Richard in that I don't necessarily think of cities themselves as beacons of enlightenment against a hinterland, which is a fortress of reaction, or a swampland of revanchism and revenge. I'm quite a bit further to the left, I think, and therefore I see all sorts of forces in cities which are retrograde and hostile to difference in various ways. And one of the ways this happens in my city, in London, is when the wealthy and privileged begin to colonize a neighborhood that they haven't had access to for one or another reason before, where it's felt like a denied environment for them. And they arrive en masse, and they begin transforming that environment into something that's comfortable for them. And we call this process gentrification, but it's really, it's quite a complicated thing. It's simultaneously a process of simplification and reduction, and of becoming legible to the state. And here's what I mean by that. I live across the street from a place called Ridley Road Market in a neighborhood called Dalston. Ridley Road Market right now, and has been for probably the last 30 or 40 years, is mostly African and Afro-Caribbean. And it has formalized stalls, in that these are stalls that are leased from the civic authority. But it is probably as close to an informal market of the global south as you're going to get in a city like London. It is an absolutely fascinating thing to watch. It's this thriving environment, ecosystem of activity at multiple scales, multiple speeds, multiple types, all woven together. Very little of it legible to the state. Most of it, informally conducted. And in some ways, not super legible to people coming from outside that community or that linguistic, ethnic, and cultural tradition. it is certainly not the easiest thing in the world for a reasonably wealthy, middle or upper class white person to arrive out of the community, walk through Ridley Road Market, and immediately be able to use that or establish relationships with the people there. And so what happens is, over time, a process of acquisition and transformation that is designed to reduce the complexity and the threat that that environment poses to the people who have the economic power to make change happen in the city. And this is not merely the indigenous power either. This is, for example, my students. I teach at the Bartlett Faculty of the Architecture, University College London. And the Bartlett's business model is essentially predicated on having mostly overseas students. So of 14 students in my cluster, 11 of them are women from mainland China. I have a young Taiwanese gentleman, a guy from Japan, and a guy from Germany. And this is a course in participatory urbanism. So we send the students out into the communities, and we ask them to identify a community group that they'd like to work with on the co-creation of some kind of project or plan that's designed to implement the intentions of everybody in that community in the urban fabric, not a top-down design by any stretch of the imagination. This particular team that we sent down, there are 3 very poised young women, very well-dressed, very privileged in Chinese society. The first thing they said to me when they got back from Peckham, which is a neighborhood very much like my own, mostly African and Afro-Caribbean, they said, "I can't imagine why anybody would ever go to that neighborhood. There's nowhere to shop." And they meant that. And the main retail corridor of Peckham is lined with the most, certainly the most economically intensive use of space I've ever seen in my entire life. Storefronts where you might have 6 or 7 independent enterprises sharing a single shop front. Places that commerce goes on, but beyond that, life goes on. An intense web of solidarity and support that functions as a fabric that holds the entire community together. And what's happening in Peckham, like in my own neighborhood, is that real estate developers are coming in, and they're buying up those spots, and they're turning them into 20-story residential towers, luxury condos, and high-end retail. And so by the end of next year, my students will be comfortable in that neighborhood because it will be Zara, and it will be Louis Vuitton, and it will be Prada, and it will be Gucci, and it won't be the Ghanaian and the Sierra Leonean vendors in their inexplicable, mysterious storefronts. What's happening is that a process of replacement and simplification is going on that may produce and perform in the economic register, but doesn't do the same things that neighborhood did previously. This is exactly as Jane Jacobs described it. Again, 5, 6 decades ago now. We know this. Why is this a bad thing? Well, I think that it's ethically shabby, to say the least, but let's take a harder knuckled look at it than that. Let's take a very materialist look at it than that. I come from technology in some ways, and so I have sort of analytical tools that aren't necessarily available to the left-inclined moralist. One of those tools is a paper that was written, a very famous paper that was written in 1973 by a guy named Mark Granovetter, Strength of Weak Ties. It's a social network analysis, and what Granovetter suggests to us is that we learn the most from those we know the least. So we're not really challenged by our most intimate relationships. We're not challenged by our family relationships, although I can hear you already saying that some of us are challenged by our family relationships. Perfectly fine. We don't receive new information from the people closest around us, whether by birth or our workplace, people we went to school with. We receive new information from the people that we have glancing interactions with, weaker links with. And these are the things, I think, ultimately in the end, which instruct us best and most fully. But there's another way of looking at the social network of the market that's getting disrupted. This is a network analysis, an axiom in network theory called Metcalfe's law. And Metcalfe's law says that the value of a network increases with the square of the number of nodes of that network. Well, what does that mean? It means that if you've engineered the first mobile phone in existence and there are no others, that mobile phone is worth nothing. The moment a single other mobile phone is created and you can have conversations between the two of them, they each have a unit of value. And the more mobile phones that are created and added to that network, the more value each one of them has. I don't think it's such a stretch to say this is how the city works as well. That the more of us that are fully present, emotionally, physically, intellectually, that we are there and we are connected to other people, that we're creating a kind of value that is the square of the number of connections that we have between us. And every time somebody is denied the ability to participate in that and sundered from the network, the value of that network begins, the network begins to decouple into sub-networks, and the value of the whole thing begins to fall apart. And I think this is a tragedy. I think this is a tragedy because under those circumstances, people retreat to their epistemic bubbles. They retreat to the conditions of safety. And we now know what that looks like. I mean, I would argue that the entire story of, and I absolutely agree, I think Rob Ford is the harbinger and the distant early warning and the sentinel of this. I think Brexit was a really bright, clear indication of what was happening, and I think the United States election is the culmination of these trends. I think we're being future shocked. I don't want to be too techno-determinist about this, but I think that what is happening now is that what's reaching us through the network is so overwhelming to us that we have no way of accounting for it or reacting to it except to cling to some kind of distant, imaginary protection of the past and of the values which ostensibly guided the past. I think we're retreating into shells. I think we're sundering the network that connects us. I think we're cutting it into shreds. And we're having a very, very hard time, aren't we, communicating outside of the membranes which now surround us and divide us. We're having a very, very hard time communicating with the people, even those people who are physically close to us, who are separated from us by their values, their beliefs, their class, their ethnicity, their gender, what have you. And I think this is almost a reversal of the Enlightenment. It is a very, very large trend. I don't honestly know what to do about it, and I don't mind telling you that I'm scared to death. So I don't know that I find that there's quite the bright spot in the city that you do. I hope that you're right, because I live in a city, and I'd like for human civilization to survive. I wouldn't mind that. But I'm going to leave you on that note, because that seems to be my job, is to be the Cassandra and to be the doomsayer. And I'm going to leave it there. We're in a very, very tight spot, and we don't have a lot of time to figure this out, because we are playing hob with the entire planetary ecosystem in a way that if we do not act now, there isn't going to be an ecosystem for us to have a civilization in. So sorry to leave you on that note. That's where I am.
And I thought I was worried.
Well, we're all worried. Let's see where to begin. You talked about this signal that the kind of Enlightenment project of reason and of sort of the triumph of reason in things like democracies being called into question now. I think Paul Krugman, 2 days after the U.S. election, said, for Americans like himself, and I would say for the way I think, that there, despite all the evidence, there was this continuing belief in this kind of romantic. It was not an Enlightenment project, a romantic project about the emancipatory potential of democracy, if not as a project, right? And that the signs now are that maybe was a little bit too idealistic. But I think what's interesting about some of what you've both talked about is the two of you seem to have a different idea about about the status and fate of the cosmopolitan condition in the city, right? Richard, you see more of a kernel in it. Your critique is basically one could argue that privileged people who are have a kind of transnational identity are cosmopolitan, even if they're only comfortable shopping in certain kinds of places, because of the scale at which they operate in the world, right? And that the transnational nature of the other population, the African population, operates at a different scale, but it is not necessarily different. They're just in a different class stratification, right? they use space differently, but they're not necessarily, they're both, I would say, representations of a cosmopolitan condition.
These are different cosmopolitanisms.
Yes.
And has anybody here taken the night bus in London? Yeah. I think the night bus is the best thing in London, right? That is the cosmopolitanism that I can identify with. And the trouble is that we, through our investments, through things like Uber, through the stances that we allow to percolate through the public discourse, one of those cosmopolitanisms should be universal, but it is no longer. And when people decide that the night bus is not good enough for them, or that they're afraid of the night bus, or that they come into contact with too many other people on the night bus, or that it's too inconvenient to walk the 50 meters to the bus stop, we have a problem. Because that's when the bubbles start to appear. That's when the membranes start to thicken. And I think that there's a story to be told first about Uber, qua Uber, and then about automated Uber coming next in the dissection of different communities out of the public sphere.
The production of kind of autonomy and the withdrawal from the public
retreat
sphere.
from the cosmopolitanism that I identify with personally.
I'm glad I'm the upbeat one.
I'm just trying to bring out the...
Jane had so many great quotes, but about gentrification, when I asked her, she said, Richard, when a place gets boring, even the rich people leave. There are really these cycles of generation and regeneration, and when a place becomes a monoculture and bland and boring, it begins to decline. So let me tell you why I think I'm optimistic. First, the simple fact of the matter is that Mrs. Clinton won the plurality of the vote. Second is, when I look at the most advanced, and this is not romanticizing, in my book I say, there are urban optimists, of which I was one until very recently, and I call myself more of a realist. And there were urban pessimists, people like David Harvey, Mike Davis, with whom I've learned a lot from. And we better figure out how to learn from each other in this field, because we all want the same thing: better, stronger, more deserved, more progressive cities. I just crunched the numbers on the vote by metro in the United States. The two metropolitan areas in the United States that are larger, that gave Mrs. Clinton her largest margins, were San Francisco and San Jose. That means the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, I could make lots of fun of San Francisco and San Jose. I can talk about how technologically elite they are. I can talk about the problem of tech companies and technological elites pushing out lower income people, and all those things are true. Regardless, 3/4 of the voters in both those metropolitan areas voted for Mrs. Clinton and against Mr. Trump. The things that were associated with a vote for Mrs. Clinton were the level of high technology startups, the level of high technology industry, the level of venture capital investment, the level of startup companies, the number of people with advanced degrees, the number of people in creative and professional occupations, the level of density. So there is something to say, and I want to give one other answer, and I don't know if it's a sufficient answer to Adam, and that's why I'm so encouraged to have this conversation with both of you, that I think in the old model of cities surrounded by suburbs, that one could wall themselves off quite effectively in a gated suburb, that one could create a near completely homogeneous by race, by income, that for all the reasons Adam said, as much as everything you said is absolutely occurring, and it's happening in New York and London, I call them the superstar cities on steroids, it's happening in Los Angeles and San Francisco and Boston and Seattle, what I call the tech and knowledge hubs, it's happening very quickly. And it seems what is happening, though, is that in local politics, you're seeing people like Bill de Blasio. The mayor has all sorts of warts. In New York, who's concerned about affordable housing and addressing the tale of two cities. The rise of your own new mayor in London may not be perfect, but a very different kind of mayor than your previous mayor. Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles, who's devoting much of his life as mayor to increasing the minimum wage and creating better jobs. I think that what cities do, even to this day, is force people to endure a Granoveteran or Jacob's world, in which there is some more level of diversity. All of those things really are in cities, and they begin to play on politics in a way that even when the rich people come back to cities, and there are plenty of rich people in London and New York, trying to wall themselves off in towers that are dark, not only at night, towers that are dark 24 hours a day, that the clash of these interests in cities at least give me a glimmer, and that light, trust me, that candlelight is flickering, folks, a glimmer of hope that we can begin politically, at least our best chance of working this out is in these dense urban centers. So that's my hope of tempered optimism, even in light of everything you said that I by and large agree with.
You make me think of the Popular Front. I mean, I feel like, I don't know if it's fair to call you a neoliberal. I wouldn't do that to your face without your consent.
I'm not, but that's what my critics call me.
Okay. Well, I don't know what my critics call me. I hesitate to think about it. But I think that, the Popular Front against Fascism United, right. There's probably some daylight between us. But that daylight doesn't really matter compared to what we're up against. That's right. And I think that we need to learn to work in coalition with people that we just don't agree with everything about.
And so I would call myself a social democrat.
Okay.
Or a socialist. But it's very interesting because many of us who feel that way, who care about those things, who are very close to the social democratic mayor of this city, very close to a left-wing mayor, former mayor of your city, because we tended to believe that you are forced, I'm going to be very honest, that we live in capitalism. We don't live in an alternative universe. And markets are very powerful. They're horrifyingly powerful. That one can use the narrative of economic progress or innovation to achieve social goods. I would say that would be what I decided in my work, that one could use the narrative of economic competition, of market-based performance. But, I only recently did this. Sorry, I don't want to make this a course in political theory, but I studied communism and socialism pretty deeply. I was a political theory minor at Rutgers College. And very early in life, I came to the conclusion that these experiments in, say, Russian-style communism went horribly off track, even though I'm a huge fan of Trotsky. And the reason they went off track is because it's hard to impose this. And I became very realistic and became a friend of a very big fan of a guy named Karl Kautsky. There's an interview out of me that I did with Jacobin, which is our most leading intellectual left magazine. And I said, as a young person, I became very interested in Karl Kautsky. Karl Kautsky was a German social democrat who said the better path to progress was not through revolution, but it was trying to build compromise and to build slowly and gradually on the already existing capitalist democracy. Well, that didn't turn out so great either, because we know what happened in Germany. But the point of fact is I think the Kautskian way is probably, at least for me, the only way. So I'd call myself not less elite neoliberal and more classical social democrat, trying to figure out a way to create a more innovative urban progressive social democracy. But it's a hard project, and I think you're right. I think at the end of the day, right now, the time is for the Popular Front.
Yeah. I worry, too, about...
You've been called, actually, a radical centrist, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think...
Which is an interesting...
when you make optimistic arguments, and I think that. But I think you're right. I call it, in our field, we suffer from the narcissism of relatively small differences, and now's a time when we really need a Popular Front. And I think the time is right. We're not always going to agree, but we know that we want to build stronger, safer, more progressive, more inclusive cities, and that we have to work on both fronts. We have to work internally to those cities to make sure they are inclusive and diverse, and we have to work externally against the bigger forces of reaction. So I would throw in with that.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is that it's sort of my professional responsibility to talk about what it is that we each have one of these in our pocket. And we live, all of us, in this curious state of schizogeography, or what I like to call multiple simultaneous adjacency. Sorry.
No, you're right.
We live in cities, or we live in suburbs.
That's the new modernism.
No, yes. Come on, don't do that to me.
Go on.
We live here in physical space, but we also live on the network. Mm. And a gated community is a great way to segregate and a great way to purify and a great way to kind of stopper down the velocity of information that you have to contend with. somehow we managed to recreate those gated communities de novo in this enormous open space that was supposed to be the world's only functioning anarchy. And, you know, again, everything happens inside history. Everything is material. Everything is, you know, the internet was never immaterial. It always happened, you know, in the transduction between a 1 and a 0 in a server that was physically located in a room somewhere that belonged to somebody as property and was subject to some terrestrial jurisdiction's regulation. We made an internet that was privatized and was mined for data by private interest. And we allowed business models to replace political ambition. And we made for ourselves a network that was as segregated as any gated community on Earth ever could be. And that's happened while we were watching. I mean, it's not like this is some kind of impersonal force. People did this. People chose this. People enacted this. And they did it under the watchful gaze of those of us who were supposed to be making sure that we were going to have some kind of different outcome with this. So it's not simply that we need to make the physical world cosmopolitan again. It's that we somehow have to smash the membranes that divide us, the filter bubbles that keep us in our little epistemic realities.
So there's two lines of discussion we could go in, and I'm not sure which one to do first. One is along what you just raised, which is around the way in which these new flows of information and modes of communication are changing what cities are, and even how they failed us in the election, because we're supposed to know more, not less. So that's one line. The other relates to, I think he's really kind of a colleague of yours, the sociologist Barber was making the argument last week that Benjamin Barber that cities have the political power to actually be this space of resistance, and in the case of the United States, can withdraw capital and in a way be a site of resistance to any radical change to the federal system. Let's start there. Do you think that's possible, or what does that mean?
So I really like Ben. Ben's book is called If Mayors Rule the World. He's writing a new book on climate change, and I've been very involved in Ben's work. I think Ben remember Ben is a political theorist, and Ben's most important work was an essay he wrote for The Atlantic called Jihad versus Macworld, where he predicted nearly 20 years ago that globalization would produce this backlash. So Ben is a very prescient thinker. I wouldn't be quite as optimistic as Ben is, and I think Ben's trying to rally the troops. I want to say two things. And first, I want to pose something to Adam that hopefully he'll react to, because he knows much more about this than I do. I think the tools of social media have been used, I think it's very McLuhan-esque. I wouldn't even say Donald Trump distracting us on Twitter. The word I like for this that I invented is not fascism, but the era of Kardashianized authoritarianism.
Yes.
And we have to realize that this guy was a reality television star.
It's the whole playbook is there. Yeah.
And it is not fascism in that's rooted in worker interest. That this is a form of Kardashianized authoritarianism, which is the same kind of thinking that goes into those students that want a Zara and to enhance their image and to take selfies. It's the culture of narcissism on steroids. But I want to say something. So I want Adam to reflect on this, because I just don't know enough about these tools of social media and how they're reflecting not just a filter bubble, but in a world of image and brand and look. And here's my self-identity. I want to suggest something as a path forward, which builds on Ben's work, that I'm not completely convinced of, but I will be writing on. And that is the fact that the nation state has become a fetter on further economic and social progress. And that the nation state itself, particularly in its US variant, now has to be dealt with. I wasn't a big fan of Stephen Harper, but he didn't scare me. the way Donald Trump scares me. That's for two reasons. One, I don't think Harper was as much problematic, but two, because the nation state in Canada isn't as powerful and certainly doesn't have the means of nuclear destruction, but our provinces are stronger, relatively speaking. And you also live in the United Kingdom. So I think one popular front with the right, I actually think we're on the losing side of history. I think Ben's wrong. I think my own estimation is that about a third it's not 1% or it's not 10%, about a third of us are doing okay. Highly educated people, knowledge, professional, creative. Peter Temin, the great economic historian who I've opened an email conversation with, has written on a marvelous paper called The Dual Economy. He does very interesting work. He argues that in the early as the 1970s and 80s, the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada became dual economies, a finance, technology, electronics, entertainment, and media sector in which 30% of the workforce is doing okay, and 70% is being left further and further behind. I want to suggest that this cosmopolitan solution is on the losing side of history. My great friend John Haidt, the social psychologist and moral philosopher, is now arguing that we need a mutual coexistence strategy. And I would like to propose that that's about the best we can do. And that mutual coexistence strategy, and my friends on the left are very nervous about this, would be that we can try to live in our own places with less national control. So an argument for devolution of power. And this is what Ben is getting at by withholding money. That the cities should be able to keep more of the resources they send to the center and should be able to be sanctuary cities. They should be able to invest in transit or whatever. They should be able to invest in inclusive zoning and affordable housing. And at the same time, if you want to live in another area of the country and have, I don't even want to articulate what those package of services are, but I think the real danger is that this group is on the losing side geographically. And if we don't do something to weaken the power of the nation state, we may be in deep doo-doo.
So I have a dual response to that. It's not that I disagree with the thesis, but I have kind of a problem from above and a problem from below. The problem from above is coordinated action on the climate. I mean, you know yourself that if every block of a city independently votes on whether or not they want to be part of a bike network, a bike path network, you're not going to have a bike path network. We're not going to have coordinated global action on the climate if we have, do you guys know what the Dunbar number is? Dunbar number is, a group of about 150 people, which social psychologists think is probably the upper bound on human groups where you can have some kind of real relationship with everybody else in the group. And as kind of a anarchist municipal libertarian sort of a guy, I tend to think that the natural political unit ought to be around that number. If we have political units of about the Dunbar number or neighborhoods or communities, we don't have coordinated global action on anything. And that scares me. The other thing is, I'm married to a woman of color. I'm a Jew. I have queer friends. I have trans friends beyond number. I don't think that we let the right dictate our right to exist. I think that's non-negotiable. And I just don't think that they will stop at the bounds of their, designated territory. I think they hate us and they want us to die. I think that's real.
Both of your issues are very relevant. On the first, I think I have a better idea than the second.
Okay.
On the first, I think we could create governance structures using this incredible federalist system that the United States and Canada have that scale to the scope of the problem. So certain problems would be that I dealt with on the neighborhood level, certain problems would be dealt at the municipal level, certain problems like transit might be dealt with at the metropolitan or megalopolitan scale. Your second question really worries me. Has anyone seen the Saturday Night Live skit, which I just played for my students in class, called The Bubble?
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you haven't, because of the damn Hulu, find a way around it in Canada. But it's just remarkable, and it's an incredibly brilliant sketch. But I do think in the near term, we need to protect those safe spaces, and that's what's motivating my idea of a call for devolution. What worries me in the long run is that that there is a bigger battle, and I agree entirely that we need a protective space now, and we need to fight a longer battle in the long run. But I'm worried, really worried about the encroachment on those. You know, still in the UK, you don't have Donald Trump as your president. Trump and this administration is shaping up in a way that could begin to trample many of those things. And I think cities, for the near term, will be the only safe space, or the only, when they say, you know, this battle over sanctuary cities is going to be real, and if you don't know what it is, you need to know what it is. Trump is saying if the American cities decide that they want to still be sanctuaries for immigrants and refugees, he's going to cut off all federal aid. Not just federal aid for that, all federal aid, and essentially try to collapse their budgets. So that's the point that I was trying to make, probably not as a long-term solution, but as a short-term. And I'm open to other ideas. I'm trying to work this out now.
Yeah, and to be clear about the Popular Front, you know, this is a gut check for law enforcement, right? Because what it means to be a sanctuary city is that law enforcement is saying that they will not go after undocumented immigrants in the community. They will ignore the law. They will refuse to enforce it. And we've had the police chiefs of Los Angeles and New York City say that, you know, they're not going to enforce unjust laws of that nature. To me, that's the kind of, I may not have much in common with the police chief beyond that, but if they will commit to that, then we can make the Popular Front. If not, we got a problem.
Yeah, we agree.
So the idea was that there was this continuing path of, let's say, diversification, and that it was just a matter of time in the demographics of the United States where this problem would be overcome, right?
Yes.
And that the sociological studies would say that the more people have to live with people that are different than themselves, the more tolerant and open they become, right? So that doesn't bode well for bubbles, right?
There's some really crazy data on this, and again, I hate to refer back to data when data has been so recently deprecated, but there's some really interesting psychological studies on this. Dominant groups are extraordinarily sensitive and extraordinarily defensive about their dominance. Like, it turns out that in a mixed group of people, you know, if there's 20% people of color in that group, white people will begin to describe that group as being dominated by them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or in a structured conversation where we know that the man has spoken 70% of time and the woman has spoken 30% of time, male observers at least will report the woman is dominating the conversation. There's something in the nature of dominance that, or privilege, that makes people astonishingly, in bad faith, kind of protective of that privilege, to the point where they see threats coming at them from all sides. They see their dominance being impeded, and I think so I don't know.
Well, what's the alternative?
That's it. I mean, I just don't know. If even 20% of different people in a group is enough to make somebody feel like they're physically under assault.
Right. I mean, the various modes of psychological and even physiological analysis of what's gone on, how it is that Donald Trump could have overcome all of his deficits, are that somehow he has activated the reptilian brain, right, in people in the ways you're describing, right?
Yeah.
He mobilized a very specific set of the population. And there were people who felt they were forgotten, left behind. They were racist, they were sexist, they were homophobic, they felt their country. And the problem is, with an electoral college, they have geographic power. You know, what was it, 107,000 voters in 3 or 4 states won the election? So at the end of the day, your analysis is right. The demographics are on the side of this. The generational change is on the side of it. And this is a holding pattern, but a holding pattern that because, and I actually believe that the Trump phenomenon will cause more of us to cluster in the bubbles. That more of my friends who might have lived in one of these other states are now saying, screw that. They're either saying, get me a bed in Toronto, you know, or they're saying, I'll move to LA, or I'll move to San Francisco, or I'll move to New York. I got to get out of this place because I don't know what's going to happen. They're moving to, in their view, a safe space or a sanctuary city. So I think the geographic thing becomes tilted against this form of progress in the short run. But no, in the longer run, in a generation or so, many of these things will change for the better. The other thing I think in this popular front is that the business community is split in the United States, and there are many horribly retrograde elements of the business community. But there are parts of the business community in the United States that require on a somewhat ethnically, if not class-wise, ethnically diverse labor force. And so I think there are allies to be made in a variety of places that lead me to be optimistic. The other thing that leads me to be optimistic is this experiment, like the Ford experiment, is likely to fail. It is likely not to be Trump is likely, he doesn't even want to govern. It's likely not to be able to deliver on many of his promises. So over time, I think people will get upset enough to stay home, and there'll be a turnaround. But the point is, there is this division, and I think the most important thing that we address in the short term tactically, the split, but we're going to have to deal with the division sooner or later.
So let me ask the two of you what your, if you were all powerful, I know Richard, you're working on this book about that really addresses the issue. Started, I don't know where it is now in the last 2 weeks, but you're addressing the issue of the kind of weak definition of the middle class and how it is that people who are not in that in the kind of, let's say, the creative class that have now become more broadly involved in what you've characterized as the service industries, that might be the key to unlocking a certain new dynamic in cities. So could you talk about that a little bit? And then I want to ask, in terms of this technological dystopia, what we can do to change cities on that front. But let's start with the thesis you've been working on at least before 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. In 1970 or 80, about 2/3 of it wasn't only a large middle class. There were large middle class neighborhoods. About 2/3 of Americans live in middle class neighborhoods. Now 40% do, and a small percentage live in areas of concentrated affluence, and a much larger percentage live in areas of concentrated disadvantage. The middle class, so defined, has declined in something like 203 of 229 metropolitan areas in which we have data. So the disappearing middle of a society and the disappearing middle of its neighborhoods and the lack of a pathway to economic mobility is a big, big problem. But the question is, what do we do? And I think we do two things. And look, what is different? I would have thought before that we could have some kind of national urban strategy of investment in cities, of investment in transit, and investment in affordable housing. I think that's over, history gone. So now what you can do is enable cities, just like we talked about, a la Benjamin Barber, enable cities to address these problems and control more of the resources and to do more of the investments we need. In the longer run, we have to rebuild the middle class, and I see only one way to do that. 70 million Americans, similar proportion. 50% of the workforce in the United States or Canada, the United Kingdom, are not members of the working class, the blue-collar working class. They're not members of the knowledge, professional, and creative class. They're members of the low-wage, precarious, contingent service class. They're the people who work in food service, preparation, retail sales, clerical, office work, home health care aides. Half of the workforce. The only way we're going to fix this, and that group is multi-ethnic and multiracial. It is not white. It has the highest percentage of women. It has the highest percentage of Hispanic, Latino, Asian, Black, African American. We can go on and on. Upgrading those jobs and developing strategies to make those better, more fulfilling, higher paying, more innovative knowledge-based jobs is really the way out in the long run. What really is deafening there is the silence on both parts of the political aisle. You've seen very few Democrats or liberals, and of course no conservatives want to talk about. But I think creating a new middle class by upgrading that work is the long run way out.
What strikes me as odd is if you think, at least in terms of the various rhetorics around American democracy, there have always been two poles to it. One, really more to the right, is entirely invested in the idea of mobility and upward mobility, and that involves physical mobility to move to get ahead, and social mobility. On the other side has more to do about representation and rights through the political process. What strikes me as odd in the current circumstance is is this notion that even the right seems to have abandoned this idea that mobility is the key to success, or to the so-called American dream. In the sense when you hear these interviews, that people don't want to leave their towns and their places, and that seems to me a certain collapse.
Yeah, I think, and I want to hear from Adam.
And they've taken on the representational project,
Trump has organized the stock. The people who move to cities are the mobile. They're people who psychologists call highly open to experience, also high on creativity and innovation, duh. They're people who are highly extroverted. They're the people who are likely to move. The people who are not likely to move tend to be high on conditions of diligence, conservatism. They stay where they are. They're tightly networked with family and friends. They're in their own kind of bubble. Yeah, and that's what Trump pulled on. The groups of people who are more likely to be not just economically mobile, but not mobile in terms of their geography. So absolutely. But I wanted to hear.
So Adam, the other changing.
So Paul Krugman a couple of years ago makes this really clear argument about the creation of the American middle class, about the institutions that were created, Medicare, Medicaid, federal home loans, the GI Bill. These were the things that built the great American working class, and we haven't defended those in the United States. And so, this class that you talk about comes into existence. What scares me absolutely to death is, I'm going to put my technologist's hat on for a second. The essence of humanity, in a way, or of human creativity, is not to be reductionist about it, but it's pattern recognition. It's the ability to discern and reproduce a particular state of the world. And I think this is true. This is at the heart of medicine. This is at the heart of architecture. This is at the heart of all of the professions. And in many ways, it's at the heart of all of the service industries as well. And the trouble with that is that once you can abstract something into a pattern, well, there's another name for a pattern, that is algorithm. And once you can abstract what it is to prosecute a case, what it is to diagnose a disease, what it is to act in a way that is perceived as being nurturing or caring. Once that can be abstracted into an algorithm and enacted by a technical system at scale, you can reproduce that almost without limit at something approaching zero cost. And those jobs that you're counting on never come into existence. Not merely are they not upgraded, the ones that now exist are obliterated. And this is so cheap to do and so easy to enact that even if it's not very good, even if the quality of care that we receive from automated systems is not very good, even if the quality of work that's performed is not as good as the best of us would do, it's just going to be unstoppable. I mean, I look at things, this is all in my new book. There's a project called The Next Rembrandt. And it's kind of obscene. They took the entire corpus of Rembrandt paintings and they analyzed it across, 1,300 dimensions of color depth and color intensity. And, did the painting contain a figure, and was the figure a man or a woman? Were they turned to the right or the left? They abstracted this into a series of algorithms that then 3D printed a Rembrandt that had never existed before. And I'm not an art historian, but I like to think I have an eye. I would have argued to you before that there was something ineffable in the human soul and human creativity, that you could not do that any more that you could reproduce Nina Simone, or you could reproduce, any of the great high watermarks of human creativity. The next Rembrandt, if you had a stack of 50 of them side by side, I couldn't have picked the machine-generated one out of the rest. I could not have. And I would challenge people who think they can to do any better. And what really scares me is not the capacity, but it's people's belief in that capacity. If they believe that that is doable, they will invest in it, whether or not it holds water or not, whether or not it actually is very good. And the structure of our society will come to be determined by decisions based on pop culture representations about what robots and androids and computers are capable of. And that really does terrify me.
So two things. One, I am more optimistic.
It'd be hard to not be more optimistic than that.
So for two reasons. One, we used to employ nearly everyone doing agriculture. Now 1% or 2% of the workforce in Canada or the United States do that. We used to employ nearly everyone or large shares of the population making things. Now 5 or 6% of the population actually makes things. We do create new work. And as Jane Jacobs would remind us, that is what cities do. They create not just new ideas, they create new work. So I think we're going to have to be smart about that, but I think one of the things we could do is give people more meaningful and purposeful and less arduous work in the future. The other point that I want to agree with you on is that there's lots of conversation within the American left about redistribution and the mechanisms of redistribution. But what Paul Krugman was getting at is that, and a great, brilliant colleague of mine at The Atlantic, Derek Thompson, tweeted this at me today. It's what Granovetter's work, who you mentioned earlier, was about. There's something that we could call pre-distribution. We arranged a set of institutions, right? Granovetter said all economic markets, all economic outcomes are highly embedded. Embedded in networks and institutions. We built a network of unions and collective bargaining, which my father worked in a factory all his life. He told me, he started in 1934. He said, Rich, when I started this job, it took 9 of us to make a living wage. Myself, my 6 siblings, your grandma and granddad. When I came back to the war, as if by magic, I had a good job in the factory. It was the same job, but I could buy a house and put you 2 boys through school. Pre-distribution. Collective bargaining, unionization, Social Security, the New Deal, social democracy in Europe, Canada. We created a set of institutions that took shitty jobs and made them good jobs. So it's not just redistribution. Redistribution is really important, but even as important is pre-distribution, and that's where in the short term with these crappy service jobs that too many people do have to do 2, 3, 4 of them as a family, almost like my dad's family, we've got to make them higher paying jobs. The better outcome of that is when we do that, people have more demand, they can buy more things, the economy gets a little bit of a stimulus. So I think thinking about in the short run how we can not only redistribute, but create a new set of institutions, pre-distribute, to make work better or more at least more high paying, if not more meaningful, is something that we can accomplish. I don't think we're condemned to this.
So what are the institutional structures in the new digital age? I'm blanking out on the name of, he's actually a Canadian neocon who's in the press a lot in the States.
David Frum?
David Frum.
He's actually a very, very interesting guy whose views have changed a lot.
Yeah, so he
popular front candidate.
Yeah, so he made a plea. It was really interesting. I think he was on the Bill Maher show, and he said, the thing that allowed Trump to rise up was the undermining of faith in institutions on the right and the left. Right. So don't go, attacking the press and every institution, because basically, if there's no faith in something being more real and more true than something else, then you let this kind of these fake prophets rise. So in all of this rhetoric and software companies and others trying to kind of reimagine the futures of the city through smart technologies and the Internet of Things, what would be the governing institutional authority there?
I'm with you on municipal scale. I think that
it has to be government.
Well, it's not going to look like government as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I go into this all in way too much detail in my book. A lot of people, we haven't talked about the blockchain at all. We haven't talked about the blockchain at all.
Yeah.
And I think that there are real reasons to be skeptical about the blockchain as it currently exists, which I'm not going to go into because it will put all of you to sleep. Does everybody know what the blockchain is? No. All right, okay. Show of hands, how many people have heard of Bitcoin? Okay. The blockchain is a distributed mechanism of authenticating accounts and facts that lies underneath Bitcoin. It's what allows Bitcoin to work in the way it does. That, in other words, there's no need for a central bank, a government institution, any kind of centralized clearinghouse to validate an individual account. It's done distributed across the network. It's a computational process. Bitcoin itself is probably not that interesting. Even digital currency itself is probably a whole lot less radical than we think it is. But this idea of a decentralized, distributed coordination mechanism that allows us to verify things without recourse to a central authority underlines the potential for political organization of leaderless horizontal organizations at global scale that can own property, that can hire people, that can act and operate in the world like a company could. It's a very interesting technology, and I think that it's reasonably obscure right now. It's one of those kind of low probability, high impact outcomes that we need to be paying quite a lot of attention to. Because
does blockchain have a board of directors?
It doesn't need a board of directors. I don't want to be a techno-utopian because I did that once with the internet, and look where we are. There are a lot of reasons to be really, really skeptical about blockchain technologies, not least of which is the fact that it emerges from an anarcho-capitalist project, a very distinctively anarcho-capitalist project. But I think that there are coordinating mechanisms that we don't even necessarily understand yet that form the crux of a true 21st century politics.
So you're saying it's a model for a kind of politics?
It's a model and a framework and an infrastructure. It has the very real.
Yeah, no, I was just listening to you talking about the internet being your hopeful optimism in the same way urban clustering and urbanization was my hopeful optimism.
Yeah.
And I think there's a certain utility in having that optimism tempered by the forces of control, whatever we want to call them, the forces of reaction and backlash. And in many ways, this moment is very useful because it makes us really begin to understand that we can't project. I remember the days of people projecting their hopes on the internet and startups and .com. I remember my own days of projecting my own hopes on urbanization and clustering and the power of cities. All of those things can and should be tempered. But I want to come back to my first principle, is that this is a period of incredible disruption. We cannot minimize everything we're talking about is a kind of disruption that human beings were completely, from the technological scale to the rise of knowledge, to the rise of clustering, to the spikiness and concentration of economic assets. So it is only normal to expect that you would get waves of backlash, particularly of those who thought they were privileged and ended up finding themselves dispossessed. But the clock of history goes on, and one has to build alternatives and alternative pathways. I just think the most important thing is where it's very interesting to get a David Frum and a Joel Kotkin, who I would consider to be on the Republican side of normality, Richard Florida, all of us saying we have to have an alternative to this thing, and a Ben Barber, and to some degree that involves empowering the local. We can't quite define what that means, but in some degree it means giving people and all of, what was the market you started with, the name of it, near your house?
In London.
Ridley Road Market.
Giving the folks in that market the ability to control and their own destiny. Giving people in all scales the ability. And I think there is something in that project that if we can begin to focus on, that points us a way out of this.
I think Murray Bookchin is a really interesting writer. Toward the end of his life, he basically gave up on being a thought leader, and he moved to Vermont, and he tried to make local municipalism happen. He really, he acted in the world as he saw fit. And his last writing, his last work is all about what he called, I think it's kind of not such a great title, but libertarian municipalism. And to me, that's sort of the pole star of my hope. I think just as it's important to have optimism tempered, it's important also to have reasons to want to get up in the morning and try to build things. And you've seen, my general disposition towards things. I think it's especially important for people who are inclined to see the converging clouds to have reasons to want to get up in the morning and build things. And for me, building out the infrastructure of that 21st century municipal, rather anarchist technology it's sufficient for me.
And that goes back to your question about what is the city and how we can shape it. If you ask me, the weakest area of scholarship, because it's been systematically disinvested in, most of the scholarship in government or in political science is about empowering the nation state, state security policy, federal urban policy. The idea of understanding urban governance, if you would, municipal governments, radical municipal localism, there are very few people in the world who actually study this and do research. There's very little, whether we discount the data. So trying to build up capability in this area, what would be a democratic, localized governance structure is a big area that we really need investment in research and scholarship. Because, I mean, we could name on one hand the people at University of Toronto who even come from our
We have tried to name them.
Yeah, but who do this. I mean, I can name David Wolf would be an expert, and there would be several others, but it's not a large group. And it's a group. It's an area of research that if we're serious about building a more optimistic, more democratic, more progressive 21st century society, that we need real expertise in.
I would add, you know, there's two things. I made my list of people who would pretend to be or would claim to be experts or have something to say about the city, but I didn't list people in the humanities and in history, and it is really actually important.
Really important.
To have historians and people who actually can put these patterns and these traditions in a context around, let's say, the struggle for democracy or the formation of, you know, nation states, et cetera. We have a few minutes left. Maybe we could take a few questions. You guys up for that?
Always.
Yeah.
Okay.
One request.
That's the most fun.
Yeah.
Sometimes we get those questions where somebody stands up and then they'll say, you know, this isn't really a question, it's more of a comment.
Those aren't allowed.
Seriously, I'm not having it. So ask questions, please, by all means.
Nice speech. Thank you.
I'm glad you said it. Okay. Do we have any takers? Because their lights are very bright and I
we
can
hardly
hardly
see your hands. But
You need to do it with a mic for posterity.
Yeah. Oh, hey.
Great.
Hey.
Wow.
That
Hi,
helps.
everybody.
Howdy.
So what do you think a person like Donald Trump will do to a multicultural city like Toronto?
Well, you know, one of the interesting things, and we'll come back to it, is the contrast between Ford and Trump. And as retrograde as Ford was, his coalition was multi-ethnic and multiracial, which I think bodes well for Toronto. I think Donald Trump can really harm the U.S. cities. I think he can really do harm to Mexico by screwing with the U.S.-Mexican trade. Although I heard an interesting fact. I was just in San Diego. For every job Donald Trump tries to pull back from Mexico, and these are from industrial developers, he will cost 10 jobs of Americans. So that math works against his little scheme. I think he can try, and he can externally hurt the multicultural city. He can withhold funding. He can create more austerity. But I don't think he can destroy this experiment. I really think that if anything, listening to Adam tonight, he will cause more of a popular front between the various factions in the city, and he'll force some of these elites who are, you know, a big darn problem to wake up and smell the coffee. So I think in the short run, he may be able to damage some U.S. cities. In the long run, he will not stamp out this. But in the short run, it could be painful.
I guess I'm more oriented toward the long-term structuration of affect. I recall a friend of mine in Italy telling me that at the beginning of Berlusconi's regime, there was a survey of schoolgirls asking them what they wanted to be when they grew up. And they said doctor, lawyer, architect. After 15 years of Berlusconi, they said talk show host, swimsuit model. People had internalized things. I mean, this is what happens to people under that kind of regime where certain kinds of things are valorized and normalized and relentlessly pushed onto people. We're not immune to these things. So I don't dispute what you're saying, but I really worry about what it is that we want and how it is, what negotiations we make with ourselves, what lines we cross And particularly for people who are very, very young now, who grow up in no other world and know nothing else than what they're about to see through the media, through their networks, around them, the behavior that they're going to see in their schools, what they think of as desirable, what they think of as attractive, and what they think of as ordinary. That, is something that we're going to have to keep a very close eye on.
People have been talking about the Berlusconi model, and they, one Italian observer was saying the mistake was attacking him in a way at a personal level or an aesthetic level instead of just hammering on his policies.
Yeah, I saw that piece.
And I thought that was an interesting argument. Because I agree that Kardashianization is about kind of emptying out of a certain set of values. But
it's Kardashianized authoritarianism, which against a real multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-class city. And that's the battle we're in. I cannot believe that Kardashianized authoritarian, especially as the father of a 1-year-old girl and a 14-week girl-to-be, I cannot believe that model will take hold. I cannot allow myself to believe that we will live under Kardashianized authoritarianism. But boy, oh boy, it is a very strong countermodel.
Can we get a mic up there? Thanks.
Oh, hi, thanks very much. If cities are going to be the path out of the darkness and they're going to need resources that they generate, and how do you think, I want to make this a question, how do you think cities can maximize the fact that they control the most valuable property on earth? And why aren't they doing more of it? And maybe that's the reason why we don't have more experts in city governance. There may be powerful forces that don't want it.
Thank you, Gail.
Yeah.
Gail Lord.
Yeah.
Let me start. In the new urban crisis, I talk about two things. Drawing off Alan Scott, my dear friend, I call the urban land nexus. The fact that so much because of the clustering of capability, and that's not just sophisticated capability, all the things Adam mentioned. A lot of our innovation, particularly in popular culture and many things, comes from the bottom up, and we discount that and then we valorize it. We have a situation where we have a lot of land in the world. Let's call it the paradox of land. We have a look at Canada. We have an abundance of land all over, a giant unoccupied place, and we have constant, what's the thing, 80% of the population lives on 2% of the land area, but no, it is on a fraction of that land that we are creating real value. So yeah, we got to do something about that, and that's going to take a real big local and national strategy. We're going to have to figure out ways so that other kinds of places can develop, that we can spread that development, and that we have the kind of transit and affordable housing we need to make these places work. It's a big agenda. But you're absolutely right. That location, and what's interesting about the urbanized knowledge economy is these very spiky clusters become incredibly valuable. Now, that's not only a local issue. The investment in this, as Saskia Sassen has shown us quite rightly, it's not just local investors who control this land. These investors, and not individuals, investment syndicates and companies are globe straddling. So now you have a city turned into a global class of investment asset. And that is a real issue. I think local leaders are going to have to grapple with it first in this present moment, because national leaders won't. But that is a big issue going forward.
I guess my only response to that is that the sophistication of the rhetoric around densification that I'm exposed to, particularly from real estate developers, is relatively low. Everybody seems to have gotten the memo that densification is this wonderful thing, and certainly it's a way to extract value from land rights. But they're just building up without doing anything about the infrastructure, without doing anything about the sewerage or the transit service or the National Health Service. In the UK, the NHS is by postcode. So when you put 2 new mega towers in, and all of a sudden you've got 10% more people in the district. That's
Same
10%
thing
more.
happening here.
Say again?
Yeah.
So it's the same thing here, yeah.
So
So the level of sophistication is just not there. And I think that we've gotten really lucky in a weird way so far, in that there are so many warehoused luxury apartments because the density figures are nominal. They're per unit. There aren't actually people in those units. 80% of them. And I think
Well, there are here actually.
they've all moved here. Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe okay.
So I actually think this is an area where we are ripe for the popular front. In the absence of a unified progressive left position, what has happened is a group of so-called market urbanists. These are incredibly neoconservative people, have co-opted the debate.
I wonder who you could possibly mean.
And their debate is thus: if we just get rid of land use regulation,
Oh my God.
if we just massively, this is the winning argument. This is in Obama's report to the president, economic report to the president. If we just deregulate land use, my book goes on a tear on this one. If we just deregulate land use, we will have a magical equilibrium. And we will generate condo tower after condo tower. And not only will we have enough space, inequality will cease to exist. What?
You mean like Ed Glazer?
What
Ed Gla- it's just- why don't we say his name?
Ed
Come on,
Glazer.
let's just-
It goes much farther than Ed. It's not
Yeah,
just Ed.
yeah.
It's a decent human being.
Yes.
It goes, it is
but-
a whole series
You are
of actors.
kinder than I'm willing to be.
It's
No.
a whole series of actors.
Yeah.
Far beyond him. But the point is, in addition to many other things that it won't work, because acquiring land at the center is horribly expensive and building towers is even more expensive, there is one thing in scarce resource in the society that Adam pointed out in the market example. It is real great urban neighborhoods that work at the right scale of density, of pedestrian friendliness, all the kinds of things that Jane Jacob wrote about. The reason those neighborhoods have become expensive is because we don't have enough of them. If we start annihilating those neighborhoods, which is what this thing is aimed at, if we start annihilating the great neighborhoods that we have left, we won't have any more. And so the point is we have to figure out how to scale and create more of these kinds of neighborhoods, livable, walkable, density, whatever, instead of trying to eviscerate the ones we have. And I think this is an area where we definitely need an accommodation.
Don't you
because in
have
the
faith-
absence, the market urbanists win.
Don't you have faith that we could, those neighborhoods are really just the residue of, of another market moment in the late 19th century? Don't we have the capacity to create them now in let's say the areas of Toronto, the northern areas of Toronto, which only are one generation
And in the
of
suburbs.
growth in the suburbs?
In the suburbs and many
Yeah.
other places we can retrofit, but we've got to pay attention to this instead of thinking we're just going to build these towers and they're going to solve all our problems, which is just nonsense. Sorry. Just nonsense.
Question, it seems there is a consensus among you that the increase of density is ongoing trend. Now, it's quite surprising to me because we have much better telecommunications now, so people
Can you speak up
go
a little bit?
video-
Yeah,
You're going to need to
I'm having
speak
trouble
closer to the
hearing
bike,
too.
man.
I'm having trouble hearing too.
Worse.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just
Better.
you guys, just speak
Yeah,
into
it seems to be a consensus here in terms of the density is going to continue increasing. Now we have a much quicker telecommunication, much better video conference and everything. We have much quicker transit. So with, for example, high-speed railway, if you are saying Birmingham and London, becoming almost one metropolitan.
That's right.
So why do we believe that even with much better communication in all the different ways, physical and telecommunication, we are not going to see these neighborhoods coming outside of the cities and still being connected?
Yeah, I think my answer to that is that we have to build coherent metropolitan areas linked by transit as well as roads, and even more so megalopolitan areas, conurbations of multiple metros. I was lucky enough to be part of a conversation last week at the Urban Studies program in which a member of the audience stood up and said at this university, they were creating a new center at Scarborough for the study of suburbanisms. I found that to be just fascinating because actually I think the scale of the retrofit, and given everything Adam said about gentrification and the expensive city and so on and so forth, I think the suburban retrofit and the connectivity between these far-flung suburban areas and the urban core is very important. So I think all of it, but it means building not only urban cores that work, building metropolitan and even megalopolitan areas that work and serve more people.
But
The- the
but the argument you're making that there's a correlation between the growing ability to communicate electronically and somehow less of a need for physical proximity.
That's been debunked.
That was projected by theorists like Melvin
Yeah, that's debunked.
Weber and others decades ago. And I think if you think about things like commuting and there are a whole other set of factors that sort of undermine that correlation.
Yeah,
Just because we
Tinder
can
doesn't work
communicate
in the
more
suburbs.
doesn't mean we can be more spread out. What?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is it, right? I mean, this is it. Tinder doesn't work in the suburbs. Grindr doesn't work in the suburbs. Not saying how I know that. Look, if you want to achieve that, that's fine, but it's a 100-year project. And you can build whatever you want, but culture takes time to bed in. These things that we talk about, the organic fabric of connectivity that makes a great urban neighborhood work, it's not magic. It's just a residue of a great many human interactions over a long period of time. That's what creates the value. So just about I had a crisis of faith as an urbanist a couple of years ago. I visited a friend in a suburb of Seoul. And it was one of these suburbs that had been built from the ground up to look like a replica of the Upper West Side. It was better than the Upper West Side, right? It had sidewalk cafes and jazz combos and organic grocery shops, and it had everything you could possibly want. Except A, it was a monoculture, and B, it was brand new. Nothing wrong with that, and I'm sure the people who live there live a very high standard of life, and they enjoy it greatly. But it's not, I think, what we think of as a great urban neighborhood. It might be in 100 years' time. It might even be in 40 years' time, if everything keeps operating more or less the way that it has been, which I don't think is a sure bet at all. But I think if we want those kinds of neighborhoods, we have to invest in them, and we have to build them, and then we have to wait.
But Adam, you said something really powerful that I will use and remember, that I never quite thought this way, in the intersection of the virtual world or the technology world and the urban world. I do live two existences, and I've never really thought about it that way. There is an existence that I have in Toronto, which I love, and I love this city, but there's an existence I have in this world, which is mainly outside of Toronto.
Okay.
And I think that dualism is something that I've never thought about sufficiently enough. That in fact, probably more, not the people I go out to dinner with, because they tend to be where I live, but the people I communicate with on an everyday basis are not here. And that connectivity, even if I look at my research group, I could argue that more than 50% of it, more than 50% of my collaborators are stretched across different geographies. I think that dualism is something that's really important, and I certainly have not thought long enough. So these two worlds exist in a kind of tension that is very powerful.
One more.
Young lady back there? Oh, no? Get her a mic right there, please. No.
Can we vote?
I think we're going to fight over.
Okay, we'll do two.
Two. I agree.
Okay, fair enough.
You're
Sorry.
right. That's right. Two.
So you mentioned, this idea of loosening kind of land use regulations and planning and all of this is not sort of the way forward. And how do you reconcile that idea with the fact that at least in Toronto, it looks like, the supply of housing is kind of constrained and limited, and it's really reducing affordability in this city. So, how do you kind of reconcile with actually what's happening and what's the way forward and what's the solution?
So two things. One, I think we do need to build more. And in the book, I not only call them NIMBYs, I call these privileged folks who want to protect the new urban Luddites. The new urban Luddites. They're equivalent to the people who smashed the machine. So we do need to build more. And we do need to alleviate supply constraints. But we need to do it with reasonable land use and building regimes. So just sticking up towers in the middle of everywhere and thinking it's going to solve the problem, and I would go further. What you end up with is precisely what Adam said. You end up with a bunch of towers marketed at billionaires, or at least multimillionaires, who are buying these as investment. Sometimes they're renting them out. Happens a little bit more in Toronto. But many times they're just completely empty. That we need a real commitment to affordable housing. And we need a commitment through government support. In one way, I can go through a laundry list of ways government might support inclusionary zoning, rent control, government housing vouchers, income supports, but we need a real commitment to affordable housing to maintain exactly what he said is the lifeblood of cities.
Yeah, I'll go a step further. I don't know how it is here. In London, affordable housing is technically 80% of market rate, which is way out of reach for most people. So I would say that we need a commitment to social housing.
We'd say the same thing.
That's through many of the mechanisms that we've named. But I think we should be unafraid to call it that. The anarchist in me thinks that there are ways to relax regulation without giving things away to the big developers. There's things like beta projects in Dublin, Ireland, or the Croydon Council in London has something called meantime use. These are ways that you can kind of relax the regulations that keep people from building the extra unit behind their house or keep people from doing small, innovative things at local scale that actually bring value to the community that aren't at all the same thing as what Ed Glazer is talking about, just eliminating regulation altogether.
Yeah, this is why understanding history is important, because zoning as it existed, of the kind that Jane Jacobs is very critical of, which comes from an industrial age where we had to be, saved from being close to workspaces, and there was a kind of dream of the Garden City. Those kind of zoning regulations tended to endure in our system of regulation well beyond when they were needed or productive. So, in fact, the renaissance of Toronto's downtown is the result of the deregulation of zoning a generation or so back, which was the effort of many architects and good politicians and others that were involved in that, and that has had a positive effect. But that doesn't mean that all zoning is bad. That's around inclusionary, or around the issue of, now we have to think about zoning with regard to issues of climate, issues of human health, sound, light, all these things actually are issues of design and planning. It's not just like anything goes, right? So we have one last question.
Are neighborhoods like Shoreditch and Williamsburg and Queen Street West, are they ideals that we should continue trying to move toward? Are these already failed in terms of the Virgin mobile store has replaced the local artisanal? So that's my question in terms of how do we move forward. And I guess my second question is, we actually have a lot of activity around ground up people organizing, collectively buying property together. Is that something that can be scaled to work with
community land
municipalities?
trusts?
I mean, we see it in Berlin, we see it in Amsterdam.
Yeah.
So it's two questions.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the self-build things that are going on in Berlin. I'm really interested in community land trusts as a mechanism for preserving things for local people. I want to speak more to your question about Shoreditch and Williamsburg, and I don't know Queen West that well, but I do know Shoreditch really well. I can't afford it. And I do know Williamsburg really well, and I couldn't afford it 10 years ago. I don't think that those are models for anything that I recognize, because they're exclusionary. And it isn't merely the price tag that's associated with it. It is, and this may be what Trump is speaking to and activating. Maybe, Rob Ford and Doug Ford spoke to here and activated. There is a kind of a global, glossy cosmopolitanism. It's not Kardashian cosmopolitanism. It's good taste cosmopolitanism. It's the taste of these chairs. Mm-hmm. It's the taste of our clothes. It's, these things are shibboleths. They are, in some ways, they are themselves exclusionary. They are identification friend or foe symbols, and a lot of people see in them foes. And I don't know what to do about that, but I don't want to live in a neighborhood that's one clever little twee boutique after another, because that's not representative of the world. It's a very tightly edited, curated selection of the world. It's very tasteful. Everything is pleasing to the eye. Everything, you want to buy it and put it on your table, but that is just not the world. And I think that there's a problem with that. that goes deeper than simply it's too expensive. I think it's an attempt to edit reality in a way that's ultimately not good for either the people who are able to take advantage of it or people who do not feel themselves reflected in it.
I'm again just slightly less pessimistic, although I agree with much of what Adam just said. I think in many respects, those are places people really want to be. They're walkable, they're dense, they're certainly more diverse than an exclusionary suburb, both in terms of race and ethnicity and socioeconomic diversity. No, are they as diverse as I would like them to be? But here's what I've come to. There was a great urban economist named Charles Thibault. And Charles Thibault argued that basically people should be able to vote with their feet. They should be able to live where they want and live the kind of lives they want and put themselves in the kind of community that respects and acknowledges them. I think there are the kind of people who like to live in Williamsburg and Shoreditch and Queen West, and I think they're the kind of people who like to live in the Annex, and I think they're the kind of people who like to live in Mississauga and Scarborough. And I could go on, and too much of my time I was spent trying to find an ideal type of community that I think would appeal to many people or more people. I just think it's really hokey phrase, different strokes for different folks. And what I found now is there's a willingness on all sides of the urbanistic aisle to say, you know what, that ain't a bad idea. And even my nemesis, Joel Kotkin, I keep thinking about this, how we have made a detente because we now realize that what he wants in his suburban world, and he calls it localism, hyper-localism, what I want in my urban world, we should respect each other's differences. So I think that's where we go. And just one more thing. I do think they are too expensive. And I think they would benefit from, if people would like to stay in those neighborhoods, we know. The people who have gentrified have been the top 10% of the income distribution, and the people who've moved out or been pushed up have been the bottom 10% of the income distribution. We should have an ability for people who want to stay in those neighborhoods to be able to stay in those neighborhoods. But I think the most important thing is that people get to be in the kinds of neighborhoods they want to be in, and I don't want to impose, even if I agree with many of the things you say, I don't want to impose my value judgment because I think people have to feel respected and feel like they can live in the kind of places they want. Are we done?
I think we're done.